The story of Arnold Paule, a Serbian peasant who lived in the early 18th century, is one of the most famous and well-documented vampire cases. This incident, investigated by Austrian authorities, played a significant role in the vampire hysteria that spread across Europe during the 18th century. The legend of Paule was meticulously recorded in official reports and influenced the way vampires were perceived in folklore and later literature. Here is a detailed account of the story of Arnold Paule, the supposed vampire. During the early 1700s, much of Eastern Europe was rife with superstitions surrounding death and the afterlife, particularly the belief in vampires. Vampires were thought to be the undead, who rose from their graves to suck the blood of the living. This belief was particularly strong in the Balkans, which included present-day Serbia, where Arnold Paule lived. In this region, it was common for people to attribute mysterious deaths, unexplained illnesses, and other misfortunes to the supernatural. Vampires were often considered the source of such problems. The fear of vampires became so pervasive that rituals were developed to protect against them, including staking corpses, burning bodies, and exhuming the dead to prevent them from rising again. The Austrian Empire, which had expanded into the Balkans, was not familiar with the local customs and superstitions. As they integrated these territories, they encountered widespread vampire folklore, which they initially dismissed. However, Arnold Paule's case was taken so seriously that it was officially investigated by Austrian military authorities. Arnold Paule was a Serbian soldier who lived in the village of Meduegna, near Belgrade, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire and later came under Austrian control. While serving as a soldier, Paule reportedly had a disturbing encounter with a vampire. This event occurred in a different region, where vampire beliefs were widespread, and it would later play a crucial role in the development of his own tragic story. Encounter with a vampire. According to local reports, Paule claimed to have been attacked by a vampire during his military service. He believed that the vampire would try to turn him into one of the undead after his death. To protect himself, Paule took preventive measures based on local superstitions. Protective rituals. Paule exhumed the body of the vampire that had attacked him, drove a wooden stake through its heart, and then consumed some of the soil from the grave, which was believed to ward off the vampire's curse. These actions were part of traditional anti-vampire rituals, which were thought to protect someone from becoming a vampire after death. Despite these efforts, Paule feared that he was still cursed. After returning to his village, Paule tried to live a normal life. However, he continued to speak of his encounter with the vampire and the fear that he might one day become one himself. In 1726, several years after his return, Paule died unexpectedly. The exact cause of his death is unclear. Some accounts say he died after falling from a hay wagon, while others suggest a sudden illness. Unnatural death and suspicion. In many cultures, an unnatural or sudden death could heighten fears of a person returning as a vampire, and Paule's death was no exception. Given his prior claims of being attacked by a vampire, the villagers were especially concerned. Shortly after Paule's burial, strange events began to occur in the village. Mysterious deaths and nightmares. Several villagers reported seeing Paule after his death. They claimed he appeared at night, lurking around their homes. Some villagers also began to experience strange nightmares in which they were attacked by an unseen presence. Over the following months, several villagers fell ill and died under mysterious circumstances. Fear spread throughout the village that Paule had returned from the dead as a vampire. As more people died and sightings of Paule continued, the villagers became convinced that he was the cause of the mysterious deaths. In accordance with local traditions, they decided to exhume Paule's body to determine whether he had become a vampire. Exhumation of Arnold Paule's body. When the grave was opened, the villagers were horrified by what they found. Paule's body appeared unusually well preserved, despite having been buried for several weeks. His skin looked fresh, his nails and hair had grown longer, and blood was found at his mouth. According to vampire folklore, these were clear signs that Paole had become one of the undead. The staking of Arnold Paole, the villagers, fearing that Paole would continue to prey on the living, took action. They drove a wooden stake through Paole's heart, following traditional vampire hunting practices. Witnesses claimed that when the stake was driven into his body, it emitted a groan, as though the corpse was still alive. This further confirmed their belief that he was a vampire. To ensure he would not rise again, Paole's body was then burned, and his ashes were scattered. Exhuming the victims, the villagers were still concerned that Paole's victims might also turn into vampires. They exhumed the bodies of those who had died after allegedly being attacked by Paole. These bodies were similarly found to be in a suspiciously well-preserved state. Following the same procedure, the villagers staked and burned the bodies to prevent the spread of vampirism. For a few years, the village returned to relative peace after the exhumation and destruction of Arnold Paole's body. However, in 1732, a new wave of deaths occurred, reigniting fears that vampirism was still a threat. This time, the deaths were not directly linked to Paole, but the villagers believed that the original vampire had spread the curse to others. New deaths and vampire attacks. Several villagers began to experience similar symptoms to those seen in the earlier outbreak, including strange dreams and sudden illness. Within a short period, multiple people died under mysterious circumstances. Once again, the community suspected that vampires were responsible. Another exhumation, as before, the villagers exhumed the bodies of the newly deceased to check for signs of vampirism. The bodies showed similar characteristics to those previously exhumed. They were well preserved, had blood at their mouths, and exhibited other traits associated with vampires. The villagers staked the bodies and burned them in an effort to stop the deaths. The renewed outbreak of deaths and the fear of vampirism drew the attention of the Austrian authorities. At the time, the Austrian Empire controlled much of Serbia, and they were keen to maintain order in the region. Reports of vampire outbreaks were alarming, and officials decided to launch a formal investigation. The Austrian military surgeon Johann Fluckinger was sent to Meduegna to investigate the situation. In early 1732, Fluckinger and his team exhumed several of the recently deceased bodies to see if there was any evidence of vampirism. His findings were documented in an official report that was later published and widely circulated throughout Europe. Fluckinger's report, known as the Visum et Repertum, Seen and Discovered, provided one of the earliest official accounts of vampirism. It described the exhumation of the bodies, the strange preservation of the corpses, and the evidence that they had been feeding on the living. Findings in the graves. According to Fluckinger's report, the bodies showed little signs of decay. They were plump, their skin appeared fresh, and blood was found in their mouths. These observations matched the traditional vampire traits described in local folklore. The villagers' claims that these individuals had been seen after death were also noted. Actions taken. Based on Fluckinger's findings, the bodies were staked and burned. The report concluded that the deaths were indeed the result of vampirism, lending credibility to the belief in vampires at the time. The Visum et Repertum was widely circulated and translated into several languages. The detailed account of Arnold Paole and the vampire outbreak in Serbia fueled the growing vampire hysteria in Europe. Intellectuals, theologians, and the general public were captivated by the story, and the belief in vampires began to spread beyond the Balkans into Western Europe. Influence on literature and culture. The case of Arnold Paole contributed to the development of vampire mythology in literature and popular culture. The descriptions of Paole's supposed vampirism, including the exhumation and staking, influenced later fictional depictions of vampires. Authors like Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, 1897, drew on these real-life vampire reports when creating their stories. Skepticism and scientific explanations. In the years following the report, some scholars and scientists began to question the vampire hysteria. They suggested that the preservation of the bodies could be explained by natural processes, such as the cold climate slowing decomposition. Others believed that the vampire panic was a reflection of the social and religious tensions of the time, with vampires serving as a convenient explanation for unexplained deaths and illnesses. The story of Arnold Paole is one of the most famous and influential vampire legends in history. It is a tale rooted in fear, superstition, and the desire to explain the unknown. While modern science has largely debunked the existence of vampires as literal creatures, the case of Arnold Paole continues to capture the imagination. Paole's story played a crucial role in shaping the cultural understanding of vampires, turning them into the iconic figures of horror that we know today. The fear of the undead, the mystery surrounding death, and the allure of vampire legends have ensured that Arnold Paole's name will forever be linked to the world of the supernatural.